Hey guys, tonight we wander far, far into the desert, so deep that the dunes themselves seem to hum lullabies beneath your feet. The city of Timbuktu flickers ahead, almost like a mirage, but it's no trick of the heat. It's a place that once brimmed with learning, debates, and entire libraries of manuscripts that now lie buried under centuries of dust. You might imagine camels trudging through golden light, merchants haggling over blocks of salt, and students squinting at faded parchment while sand piled up against their doorsteps. It's romantic, it's mysterious, and it's also a little sweaty, because if you were actually trekking here without SPF 50, you probably wouldn't survive the day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. I love picturing this sleepy caravan stretching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward Timbuktu's sun-baked walls, half blinded by glare bouncing off dunes. The air smells of dust mixed with smoke from cooking fires, faint hints of millet porridge drifting past. Traders once called this city the place at the end of the world. And from where you're standing it feels true. Yet, somehow, this remote outpost became the keeper of Africa's most dazzling manuscript collections. Some say as many as 700,000 documents once circulated here, though historians still argue whether the numbers were exaggerated by dazzled travelers. Whatever the tally, the libraries were real, and they whispered stories across centuries. You brush sand from your clothes and squint at the skyline. Squat earthen towers, their surfaces combed into ridges like giant loaves of bread cooling in the sun. That's Timbuktu's look, mud brick mosques that have stood through rainstorms and desert winds, though not without help. The locals replaster them every year in a festival that's basically part religious devotion, part giant neighborhood repainting party. You'd never guess those brown walls sheltered vaults of delicate parchment, some inked in gold leaf, others scrawled in everyday script. Picture yourself stepping closer. Your sandals crunch on gravel, your breath dries in your throat, but your curiosity keeps tugging you forward. Beneath those adobe facades lies a forgotten universe, treatises on astronomy charting the Sahara stars, medical recipes involving desert herbs, and instructions for what to do if your camel develops hiccups. Yes, that last one is real. Medieval veterinarians were surprisingly concerned about livestock digestion. As you push open a wooden door warped by the heat, you step into shadow. Cool air brushes your skin, smelling faintly of leather and old ink. Shelves tilt with the weight of manuscripts bound in goatskin, tucked in boxes of carved cedar, or sometimes just wrapped in cloth. Many were copied by hand in careful calligraphy, each letter bent like a dancer's bow. Some pages shimmer with script so delicate, you'd think the scribe had trained by writing on butterfly wings. And somewhere here, a scribe probably did make jokes in the margins, because humans never resist doodling when bored. You lean closer to one volume, fingers hovering but not touching. The ink dances across the page in Arabic, peppered with local tongues, Songhai words squeezed in like polite guests, Fulani proverbs curling at the edges. Each page feels like a conversation between cultures, and you realize Timbuktu wasn't just a dot on a map. It was a buzzing hive of trade and thought. Gold and salt passed through its gates, yes, but so did geometry, poetry, and gossip about the best caravan snacks. Still, not everyone agreed on the scale of Timbuktu's grandeur. Some 16th-century Moroccan visitors called it overrated, too hot, too sandy, not enough taverns. Others painted it as a city of near-mythic wealth, where streets shimmered with nuggets of gold. Historians still argue whether those glowing descriptions were tourism brochures in disguise, or honest awe at the scholarship thriving here. Either way, you stand in the echo of that contradiction. A city both dusty and divine. Your sandals scuff again, and you notice how quiet it feels. A silence heavy with centuries, as though the manuscripts themselves are holding their breath. Each one is a survivor, having outlasted termites, desert storms, and the occasional careless goat. And yet, despite their fragility, these texts traveled, slipped into caravans, carried across dunes, sold to scholars, hidden from raiders. They were never meant to sit still, but now they huddle like tired travelers at the end of the road. You inhale, and even that feels risky, like the manuscripts might crumble with one exhale too sharp. Dust glitters in shafts of light, golden motes drifting like miniature suns. Somewhere outside, a boy calls his donkey, and the bray slips into the room, a reminder that the living city still pulses beyond these ancient walls. But inside, you linger, leaning into the hush, realizing you're brushing against a legacy most of the world forgot. And perhaps that's the magic. You arrive expecting myth, you find mud. You arrive expecting treasure, you find brittle parchment. But then you realize parchment is the treasure, whole centuries of thought, still whispering under their coats of dust. You stand still, letting that realization soak in, until the desert itself feels like it's waiting for you to turn the page. You step back into the sunlight, blinking against the glare, and let the desert air wrap around you like a heavy cloak. Timbuktu doesn't exactly roll out a red carpet. Instead, it lays down endless layers of sand. Your feet sink slightly with every step as you move toward the city's beating heart, the market square. This was the crossroads where the desert's wealth, ideas, and gossip converged. Here, salt blocks taller than your shin once leaned against each other like sleepy dominoes, each one worth nearly as much as gold. You pause beside a stall in your imagination, and there's a merchant fanning himself lazily with a palm frond, trying to tempt passers-by into buying a chunk of rock salt that looks suspiciously like an oversized brick of fudge. Across the lane, another trader unrolls bolts of cloth dyed indigo so deep it seems to swallow light. The indigo stains fingertips for weeks, so much so that travelers often joked you could tell a merchant's honesty by the shade of his hands. Even here, humor finds a way. Your desert economy doubles as a tie-dye experiment. The marketplace hums, and yet it feels unhurried. You imagine sitting at the edge of the crowd, sipping a bowl of milk curdled slightly from the heat. Don't wince. Locals swore it helped with hydration. Around you, voices weave in Arabic, Songhai, Tuareg dialects, and even distant Portuguese, all mingling into a tapestry of sound. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu was truly a cosmopolitan hub or whether travelers just amplified their tales to impress audiences back home. But as you sit there, fanning yourself with your sleeve, it feels like the desert's version of a world trade fair. Somewhere to your left, a man boasts about caravans carrying 1,000 camels each. He's almost certainly exaggerating, think of the parking nightmare, but he gets a laugh from the crowd. To your right, a scholar slips by quietly, his robe brushing the sand. He carries a wrapped manuscript under his arm like a precious loaf of bread. In this city, books weren't just objects, they were currency. A single manuscript could be worth more than several horses. Imagine your library card having the same value as a down payment on a car. You definitely remember to return your books on time. As you wander deeper, the smells shift. First comes the sharp tang of dried fish hauled in from the Niger River, then the sweet aroma of dates spilling from woven baskets. Someone's roasting lamb over a small clay brazier, and your stomach growls even though you know eating street food in medieval Timbuktu would almost certainly have your insides staging a rebellion later. That's the unglamorous reality of history. Everything looks picturesque until you consider the plumbing, or lack of it. Now, glance down at your feet. See that glimmer in the sand? Traders sometimes dropped flakes of gold dust during exchanges. Children used to follow in their wake, crouching low to sift for leftovers. Timbuktu's prosperity rested on these exchanges. Salt from the desert, gold from the forests farther south, manuscripts copied by hand in hidden study rooms. It was commerce, yes, but also culture, braided together under the sun. Here's the odd bit. Despite its fame, Timbuktu never looked like the glittering city described in European legends. No towering palaces plated with gold, no fountains of wine. Instead, you got earthen streets, goats wandering freely, and piles of trade goods stacked under canopies. And maybe that contrast is part of the charm. You expected a desert Vegas, but you find something humbler, more human. The magic is in the people, not the architecture. You pause again as a group of Tuareg traders strides in, blue turbans wrapped high around their heads, faces shaded from the sun. Their camels carry bundles swaddled tightly, perhaps salt, perhaps manuscripts, perhaps both. The desert always kept its secrets, and smugglers thrived on that. Still, their presence here underscores Timbuktu's reputation, a place worth trudging across sand seas just to reach. And yet, whispers follow you. Rumors that the wealth is fading, that Moroccan armies loom, that termites are nibbling through some of the manuscripts stored without care. The city feels balanced on a knife's edge, its prosperity as fragile as the paper it values. You glance around, wondering if the bustling square knows it's living in what later generations will call a golden age. Spoiler, they didn't. People rarely realize they're living in an age of glory until centuries later when historians squabble about dates and definitions. You rise, brushing sand from your lap. The square continues to buzz, a choreography of trade that never quite pauses. Every deal struck here echoes across continents. Every manuscript that changes hands might be carried thousands of miles to Alexandria, Fez, or even Istanbul. And yet, for now, the air is thick with ordinary life. Children playing tag with a goat, women haggling over onions, a bored guard leaning on his spear and trying not to yawn. History tends to magnify Timbuktu into something mythical. Tonight, as you drift here in imagination, it feels smaller but also more vivid, like peering through a keyhole into a world where knowledge and salt weighed the same on the scales. And just as you start to think you've seen it all, you hear a call to prayer rising gently over the rooftops. The crowd softens, traders pause, and the manuscripts rest quietly in their wrappings, waiting for their turn to be remembered. You follow the flow of people as the call to prayer drifts away, their footsteps leading you toward the city's most recognizable silhouette, the Jingareber Mosque. Its mud-brick towers rise like giant anthills against the cloudless sky, every surface textured by wooden beams that jut out at odd intervals. Those beams aren't decorative, they're scaffolding left in place so workers can climb up during the annual replastering. Imagine having a house that requires a citywide paint party once a year. You'd either dread it or invite all your friends for free snacks and gossip while you slap on mud. Stepping closer, you feel the temperature drop. Thick adobe walls hold the cool like a secret, and you slip into shadow. Inside, the hush of prayer fades into a different kind of quiet, one threaded with rustles of parchment and the soft coughs of scholars bent over their desks. The mosques of Timbuktu weren't just places of worship, they doubled as libraries, schools, and safe havens for manuscripts. Behind wooden doors and under woven mats, texts lay stacked in bundles, some carefully bound in leather, others simply tied with string. You pause at one corner where the light slants through a narrow window, illuminating a scribe at work. His reed pen scratches across paper made from Italian linen imported via caravan. That's right. This desert city consumed imported stationery like a college bookstore at finals week. Historians still argue whether the imported papers came primarily from Venice or from Genoa, but either way, the global links are clear. Timbuktu's libraries weren't parochial, they were plugged into a Mediterranean network of trade and knowledge. Another scholar strolls past, muttering to himself. He's memorizing a passage from a law text, rocking slightly as though the rhythm of his body helps hold the words. You wonder what's behind those closed doors he just passed. Perhaps a cabinet of astronomy charts, circles carefully inked to map the stars. Or a medicine book suggesting cures for headaches involving crushed cola nuts mixed with honey. If you're picturing Advil with extra sugar, you're not far off. Now imagine the architecture itself. The floor feels cool beneath your feet, packed clay smoothed by generations of sandals. The walls rise high, tapering toward the ceiling, creating a cavernous quiet that makes even your breath sound intrusive. The scent of dust mingles with the faint sweetness of gum arabic, a resin sometimes used to thicken ink. Every sensory detail here seems designed to slow you down, to ease you into patience. You get the feeling that if you rush, the manuscripts might just close themselves out of spite. You shuffle deeper, Catching sight of a young student napping against a pillar, parchment spread across his chest like a blanket. Sleep and study have always gone hand in hand. Students in every era know the struggle of late-night cramming. One can almost imagine his teacher shaking him awake later with a sigh, muttering something timeless about wasted tuition. The moment makes you smile, and it anchors this ancient world in something familiar, the universal tradition of procrastination. Nearby, a caretaker sweeps the floor with a bundle of palm fronds tied together. Dust lifts, sparkles briefly in the sunlight, then settles again like tiny golden flakes. He pauses, leans his broom against the wall, and checks on a pile of manuscripts tucked in a clay niche. Some covers are peeling, leather shriveling from heat, pages spotted by termites. And yet, here they remain, clinging to existence like stubborn desert plants. The mosques of Timbuktu served not just as religious centers but as communal vaults. When manuscripts weren't safe at home, whether from thieves, fire, or even nosy relatives, they often ended up here. Families trusted these sanctuaries, believing that the divine presence guarded the words as surely as the walls did. Was the system flawless? Hardly. Sandstorms didn't care about your storage plan. But the survival of so many manuscripts suggests that the strategy worked more often than not. Historians still debate how organized these collections truly were. Were they catalogued like a medieval library with neat rows and subject headings? Or were they closer to a giant attic, with stacks and piles only the caretakers could navigate? Chances are, it was a little of both. Some collections might have been meticulously arranged, while others relied on memory, with scholars knowing exactly which cloth bundle held the astronomy notes versus the poetry verses. As you wander back toward the entrance, the air feels thicker somehow, as though it has absorbed centuries of whispers. You tilt your head and think you can almost hear the echo of long-ago debates about lunar eclipses or whether a certain caravan tax was fair. The walls have soaked in those arguments like sponges. And now, standing there, you're part of that long continuum, even if all you contribute is a bemused sigh and a sweaty brow. You step back into daylight, squinting as the brightness sears your eyes. The mosque looms behind you, steady and monumental, mud walls already flaking slightly under the relentless sun. You realize that just as the manuscripts needed protection, so too did the buildings themselves. Each year, the community rallied to keep them alive, mud by mud, patch by patch. A rhythm of preservation that echoed the rhythm of copying manuscripts. Repair, repeat, remember. And in that moment, you sense the fragile but stubborn determination that let Timbuktu's libraries survive long after the caravans stopped coming. You wander away from the mosque and drift into the narrow lanes of Timbuktu, where the sun bakes the mud walls until they glow a soft caramel. The air feels thicker here, trapped between houses, and every breath tastes faintly of dust. It's in these quieter neighborhoods that the real guardians of the manuscripts lived, families who carried knowledge in their homes like hidden treasure. Imagine stepping into one of these houses. A wooden door creaks open, low enough that you instinctively duck your head. Inside, it's dim and cooler, the walls plastered smooth and painted in earthy tones. A family sits around a woven mat, drinking tea so sweet it makes your teeth ache just looking at it. But your eyes are drawn to the bundles tucked into corners, cloth-wrapped, leather-bound, or sometimes just tied with fraying string. These are manuscripts, passed from parent to child for generations. Guardianship wasn't glamorous. It often meant hiding pages under beds, beneath mats, or inside clay jars meant for grain. If a stranger visited, you'd keep your voice steady while casually shifting your mat over a suspiciously flat lump. Entire families became custodians, each child raised not only to read but to protect. Some stories even tell of manuscripts wrapped in animal skins and buried in courtyards, waiting out periods of war or famine like seeds waiting for rain. You kneel to imagine lifting one of these bundles. It's surprisingly light, parchment isn't heavy, but the weight feels immense. Inside are not just prayers but legal contracts, marriage agreements, maps, medicinal recipes. In a way, each manuscript was like a family heirloom mixed with a Swiss Army knife, useful, spiritual, and deeply personal. Historians still argue whether families viewed the texts more as sacred possessions or as practical household tools, but in truth, they were both. Picture a grandmother teaching her grandson how to handle the brittle pages. "Only with clean hands," she whispers, pressing a rag of cloth into his palm. That gentle caution echoes through the centuries. You don't just own a manuscript, you carry a responsibility. And when raids or droughts threatened, families sometimes smuggled their manuscripts out with as much urgency as food or water. A camel might starve, but knowledge had to survive. Not all manuscripts were equal, of course. Some were rare treatises, beautifully illuminated with gold leaf. Others were everyday notes, debts scribbled hastily, poetry composed in the middle of the night, or weather records jotted down to predict the next harvest. Imagine opening a bundle and finding a doodle in the margin, perhaps a clumsy sketch of a camel drawn by a bored teenager. The dusty archives of Timbuktu are filled with these small, very human fingerprints. There's a quirky detail you can't help but notice. Manuscripts were often scented. Pages absorbed the smells of the home, tea, smoke, spices, and some families even rubbed aromatic oils onto covers to keep insects away. So a manuscript didn't just carry words, it carried the scent of the household. Think of it as medieval scratch and sniff history. You pause to watch a father unwrap a manuscript to settle a neighborly dispute. The text might contain an old ruling on land division, quoted as if it were a witness itself. Books weren't distant relics here, they were active participants in daily life. They held authority, like grandparents who always remembered who borrowed whose goat 20 years ago. Yet danger was constant. Termites chewed indiscriminately, rains seeped through roofs, and sometimes a single careless candle ended centuries of knowledge in one flicker. Families lived with this anxiety but refused to let go. You can almost hear their silent vow, better to risk losing it under my care than to surrender it to strangers. Even today, some guardians remain. During modern conflicts, families smuggled manuscripts out in rice sacks and grain carts, refusing to abandon them to fire or theft. That stubborn devotion stretches back to these quiet homes, where tea was sweet, walls were humble, and knowledge slept under the mats. As you step back into the alley, sunlight blinds you again. The air smells of roasting millet and drying leather. Behind you, families continue their rituals of guardianship, tying string tighter, whispering warnings to children, trusting that their dusty treasures will outlast yet another generation. And you walk on, marveling that the world's memory could be tucked into such unassuming corners. You stroll further into Timbuktu's labyrinth, and suddenly the alleys open into a courtyard where sunlight pours like molten gold. A breeze stirs, carrying with it the faint fragrance of ink and parchment, as if the desert itself were whispering lessons. You kneel to examine a loose page someone has left behind. The script winds across the sheet, looping, curling, then straightening, as if the pen were performing a dance. You trace the lines with your eyes, and in an instant you're pulled into the world of scripts, the visual heartbeat of Timbuktu's libraries. The first thing you notice is Arabic script, the backbone of scholarship here. Its elegance dominates most manuscripts, flowing right to left, letters hooked together like a chain of desert caravans. Scholars practiced for years to master the calligraphy, dipping reed pens into black or sometimes brown ink made from soot, gallnuts, or even boiled tree bark. Imagine running out of ink mid-sentence and realizing you need to cook another pot of bark stew just to finish your homework. History had its own student struggles. But Arabic wasn't alone. You spot Songhai words squeezed into the margins, sometimes written phonetically in Arabic letters, sometimes scrawled in their own form. The Songhai Empire's language was the voice of the region, and to see it wedged between lines of Quranic commentary is like finding a local accent hidden in the margins of Shakespeare. Historians still argue whether these bilingual manuscripts show genuine attempts at translation or just helpful notes for students struggling with tricky vocabulary. Either way, they prove that Timbuktu's scholarship was never isolated, it was a fusion of tongues. Nearby, a manuscript in Fulani, or Fulfulde, leans against a stack. Its curves differ from Arabic, smaller, tighter, like whispers tucked into corners. It might be a genealogy, tracing family roots through generations, or a song recorded so it wouldn't be forgotten. For centuries, such manuscripts blurred the line between scholarly record and cultural memory. You imagine a young Fulani shepherd listening to his elders sing by the fire, then later seeing those same words preserved on parchment, as though the desert itself had learned to write. The diversity of languages reminds you that Timbuktu wasn't a monolith. It was a city where North African merchants debated with West African poets, where Tuareg nomads swapped riddles with scholars from Cairo. Each manuscript is a window into those conversations. And sometimes, the window is surprisingly quirky. One surviving fragment includes scribbled multiplication tables, proof that some poor kid was stuck doing math homework even in the 1500s. Turns out algebra has been haunting bedtime for centuries. As you continue exploring, you notice that the scripts aren't always pristine. Some letters tilt drunkenly, as if the scribe had been up too late. Others trail off midline, the ink fading as though the writer sneezed and never came back. Margins bear doodles, camels, stars, sometimes mysterious symbols whose meaning is still debated. Were they talismans, artistic flourishes, or just bored doodles? Historians still argue, and you smile, realizing that the answer may simply be, yes, all of the above. Each script carries not just meaning but rhythm. Reading aloud, you'd hear cadences shaped by desert winds, pauses as long as camel footsteps, bursts of speed like galloping hooves. And behind it all, a cultural pride. To write was to weave your voice into eternity. Many manuscripts end with a humble line, "Forgive my mistakes, O reader." The scribes knew they weren't perfect, yet their imperfect lines still echo 600 years later. You bend down again, the page warm in your hands, and imagine the tools. Reed pens cut at sharp angles. Inkpots carved from bone or clay. Sand sprinkled on fresh ink to dry it quickly. It's all tactile, messy, and oddly soothing. Modern keyboards click, but here, every sentence required patience, ink stains, and probably a sore back. Around you, the courtyard hums with faint sounds. A teacher chanting aloud, a student repeating the script hesitantly, a donkey braying from the street outside. The languages of Timbuktu overlap not only in manuscripts but in daily life, where Arabic prayers mingled with Songhai gossip and Fulani proverbs. The manuscripts froze those voices on parchment, but in your imagination, they're alive again, swirling around like a desert breeze. And just as you're about to leave, you catch sight of one more script, Tuareg Tifinagh, carved awkwardly into a margin. It looks rough, almost like a secret code. Maybe it was someone's private note, or maybe just a scratch of pride. We were here too. That's the beauty of these manuscripts. They weren't just books. They were mosaics, pieced together by countless hands, countless voices, countless scripts dancing across time. You drift onward, past courtyards and alleys, until you find yourself in a shaded room where the air smells faintly of mint tea and old parchment. A circle of men reclines on woven mats, manuscripts open in their laps. Their robes shimmer in white and indigo, and they look less like solemn scholars and more like neighbors hanging out on a lazy afternoon. This is what makes Timbuktu's manuscripts so captivating. Their pages carried knowledge far beyond religion. You listen quietly as one man reads aloud a passage not from scripture, but from a text on astronomy. His voice rises and falls in rhythm, naming constellations that still twinkle above the desert today. The manuscript describes how stars could guide caravans across trackless dunes, like glowing breadcrumbs laid across the heavens. You picture yourself lying on the sand at night, camel snoozing nearby, trying to figure out whether you're looking at Orion's belt or just 3 random dots. Historians still argue whether these texts were purely practical guides or also layered with mystical interpretations, but either way, they remind you that the desert sky was a blackboard for learning. Another scholar clears his throat and flips open a different manuscript. This one contains medical recipes. He points to a line suggesting ground kola nuts mixed with honey to treat headaches, and you can't help imagining someone 200 years ago complaining about a migraine, only to be told, "Eat dessert, you'll feel better." Some manuscripts get quirkier, camel remedies for indigestion, ointments for scorpion stings, even advice on how to cool down fevers with clay pots of water. It's like a medieval WebMD, only with more desert metaphors. Not all the texts are about science or medicine. Some explore farming cycles, when to sow millet, how to irrigate gardens near the Niger, how to predict rains from wind patterns. For a city perched on the edge of the Sahara, these guides were survival manuals. Reading them feels like listening to the land itself whisper instructions. Water here, wait there, plant when the wind turns soft. Imagine consulting a manuscript before deciding whether to gamble on a second harvest. The stakes were literally life or famine. And yet, as you lean in, you notice the scholars chuckling. They're not laughing at mistakes but debating nuances, whether a certain constellation really signaled the rainy season, whether a herbal remedy was more superstition than science. You realize the manuscripts weren't dead texts, they were conversation starters. Knowledge was tested, prodded, and even teased. That gentle humor feels familiar, like a group of friends bickering about which movie is the best while knowing none of them will ever change their minds. Of course, not everyone agreed on how to interpret these texts. Some insisted astronomy was purely scientific, others layered in spiritual meaning. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu leaned more toward empirical science or mystical symbolism, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. After all, when your classroom ceiling is the night sky, it's hard not to see both math and magic. You glance around the room and see more manuscripts stacked casually in baskets. Some contain proverbs, riddles, and poetry. One line reads like an ancient dad joke: "He who eats alone, chews his tongue." You can almost hear the collective groan from students forced to copy that one 20 times. But these jokes and sayings mattered. They preserved oral wisdom that otherwise would have drifted away with the wind. The room itself hums with warmth. A boy slips in, carrying a tray of small glasses filled with tea foaming at the top. He sets it down, and the scholars pause their debates to sip slowly. Sweet, bitter, sweet again. That's the ritual of Malian tea, and it's as much about patience as refreshment. You take a glass in your imagination, the heat searing your fingertips, and you realize how perfectly the drink matches the manuscripts themselves. Layered, enduring, a little bitter in places, but sweet if you stay long enough. Somewhere in the corner, a cat stretches lazily, tail flicking against a manuscript box. You chuckle at the thought. Centuries of human effort to preserve fragile texts, and meanwhile the household cat treats them like furniture. It's a reminder that history has always coexisted with ordinary life. Scholars copying verses while goats bleated outside, or priceless parchments stored next to sacks of millet. The profound and the mundane have always been roommates. You rise to leave, but before you step out, one scholar looks up. His eyes twinkle, and he says something you don't quite catch. Maybe he's telling you that these texts are more than ink and paper, that they're echoes of laughter, worry, wonder, and everyday survival. You nod politely, even if you don't understand, and step back into the hot sunlight, carrying with you the sense that Timbuktu's knowledge was as wide as the desert itself. The sun dips lower, painting the walls of Timbuktu in soft gold, and you drift toward another house where a hush seems to linger heavier than the dust. Here, the manuscripts take a different turn. They are not recipes for tea or guides to planting millet, but thick collections of stories, poems, and epics meant to keep memory alive. You find yourself sitting on a reed mat while an old man begins to chant, his voice steady as the Niger itself. His words weave the tale of Askia Muhammad, a ruler of the Songhai Empire. You hear of his pilgrimages, his reforms, his insistence on justice. The story sounds grand, yet the rhythm is almost lullaby-like, making you feel less like you're at a lecture and more like you're tucked under blankets being read to sleep. Manuscripts here didn't only serve scholars, they kept rulers' legacies polished and alive. In a world where oral storytelling was fragile, ink gave permanence. Historians still argue whether these accounts exaggerated the rulers into near myth, or whether they're sober biographies with only a dash of poetry. Beside you, a boy tilts his head, eyes wide. The storyteller pauses to sip water, then turns the page of his manuscript, where flowing Arabic script is decorated with tiny geometric flourishes. He resumes, this time not about emperors but about caravans, the lifelines of the desert. You imagine strings of camels plodding across dunes, bells clinking, carrying salt slabs that glowed like mirrors under the sun. Some manuscripts even listed caravan expenses, fodder for camels, bribes for guards, food for drivers. It feels oddly like peeking into an ancient expense spreadsheet, complete with the universal groan about costs always creeping higher. Then the chanting shifts again, softer now, almost conspiratorial. It's a story about a woman healer who brewed potions and whispered cures that men would later claim as their own discoveries. You catch the sly humor in the storyteller's tone, almost as if he knows the manuscripts quietly recorded more than official histories. They preserved women's knowledge too, tucked between lines that might otherwise be overlooked. Scholars today still debate how visible women truly were in Timbuktu's intellectual life, but these fragments hint at presences both strong and subtle. You glance around the room, noting how these manuscripts are stored differently. Instead of baskets or stacks, some are tied carefully in leather cases. The cases are worn but sturdy, meant to protect pages from dust storms and hungry termites. Each one is like a suitcase filled with memories, ready to travel through centuries. You picture a caravan driver tossing such a case onto his camel alongside salt blocks and dried dates, as if manuscripts were as essential as food. And maybe, for this culture, they were. The storyteller's voice rises again, now reciting verses of poetry. One compares the desert wind to a fickle guest, sometimes soft and gentle, other times barging in with sand and bad manners. You smile at the humor, realizing poets have always mocked the weather, whether in Mali or Manchester. Another verse praises ink itself, calling it the shadow of memory. It's such a delicate phrase, you whisper it under your breath and feel the words dissolve like sugar in tea. Nearby, a youth scribbles on a wooden tablet, copying lines from the manuscript. He pauses, scratches his head, then smudges out a mistake with sand rubbed across the surface. The smell of cedar ink drifts faintly in the air. Watching him, you sense how manuscripts weren't only objects of reverence. They were training wheels for a whole culture of literacy. And literacy here wasn't rare. Contrary to stereotypes of dark continents, this corner of Africa buzzed with students, teachers, scribes, and debate. The old man stops suddenly, resting his hand on the open page. He mutters something about how memory is like water. It seeps away unless you cup it carefully. You realize that's exactly what these manuscripts are, cupped water. Without them, stories of emperors, caravan drivers, women healers, and poets might have evaporated entirely. And then, with a twinkle in his eye, he adds one last quip. A man without books is like a camel without a rope. He wanders. The others laugh, not mockingly but with the warmth of a shared inside joke. You chuckle too, even if you're the only one not tethered by a rope in this story. As the room darkens, lamps are lit, their flames trembling like tired eyelids. The manuscripts rest quietly, their ink glimmering in the flicker. You stand, stretching your legs, and step back into the cooling air. The chants and verses linger in your ears, like a half-remembered dream that insists on being told again and again. And you carry with you the sense that these pages are more than history, they are lullabies written on parchment, meant to keep cultures from falling asleep forever. The night deepens, and you wander through narrow lanes where lamps burn low, their smoke curling upward like sleepy sighs. You're drawn to another gathering, but this one feels different, less like storytelling and more like argument. Inside, a small group of scholars sits cross-legged, manuscripts sprawled out before them. Their voices rise and fall in measured cadence, like waves lapping against a shore. You realize you've stepped into a debating circle, where theology and law are picked apart with the persistence of desert ants dismantling crumbs. One scholar gestures toward a manuscript open on his lap. It contains legal commentary on trade disputes, what happens when a camel driver delivers salt late, or when someone cheats by watering down gold dust. You grin at the thought. Medieval Small Claims Court, Timbuktu edition. The others listen carefully, then counter with passages from different texts. Some debates drag on for hours, and you can almost hear the echoes of centuries of students sighing, "Do we really need to cover this again?" Yet these arguments mattered. They kept law and faith living, not frozen. You settle onto a mat, feeling the cool weave beneath your hands. The air is thick with the scent of lamp oil and warm with the hum of voices. One man cites a ruling that suggests traders must weigh goods with absolute fairness. Another flips the page to argue for leniency when famine strikes. You sense how these discussions weren't abstract. They guided the rhythms of caravans, markets, even family squabbles. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu scholars leaned more towards strict orthodoxy or flexible pragmatism, but here you see the messy human middle ground, people trying to balance rules with reality. Then, a younger scholar interrupts with a surprising reference, a margin note in his manuscript, written decades earlier by a teacher long gone. The note warns against greedy merchants who measure salt with narrow scoops but measure millet with wide ones. It's both practical advice and timeless sass, like a medieval Yelp review hidden in the margins. You chuckle, realizing that side comments can sometimes outlive the main text. Nearby, another manuscript is opened, this one on marriage laws. The group debates questions like, how much agency should a woman have in choosing her partner? What happens if the bride's family delays the dowry? The arguments are polite, but the undercurrent is fierce. You picture countless households waiting for rulings like these to settle disputes. And maybe, just maybe, those households rolled their eyes at how long scholars could argue over every detail. As the discussion drags on, someone finally cracks a joke about camels being more reliable than husbands. The room erupts in laughter, the tension easing for a moment. You smile at the reminder that humor has always been the pressure valve of human intellect. If you're going to debate dowries into the night, you might as well make fun of camels while you're at it. The manuscripts themselves bear witness to these debates. Their pages are filled with careful Arabic script, but in the margins are doodles, corrections, even ink blots. You imagine a scribe sneezing mid-sentence, leaving a permanent blot of history behind. Those tiny accidents feel oddly comforting, proof that knowledge wasn't created by cold machines but by humans who sneezed, spilled tea, and sometimes got bored. What fascinates you most is how alive the arguments feel. The scholars don't treat manuscripts as sacred relics locked in silence. They prod, question, disagree, and return to the text like musicians improvising on a shared melody. You think of modern classrooms, where debates about fairness and justice still rage. The room in Timbuktu doesn't feel so distant after all, just a little warmer, a little dustier, and with more camels involved. Eventually, the voices soften. Some scholars nod off, heads drooping, while others keep scribbling in lamplight, determined to get the last word on salt weights or dowries. You yawn in sympathy, realizing that even the fiercest argument can end up as background hum, lulling listeners toward sleep. You rise quietly, not wanting to disturb their intellectual wrestling match, and step outside. The night air is cooler now, tinged with the faint sweetness of acacia blossoms. Behind you, the debate continues in muffled tones, but out here, the desert stars seem to offer their own silent commentary, vast, steady, and entirely indifferent to whether merchants should use wide or narrow scoops. And you find yourself smiling at that cosmic shrug, knowing that arguments may fade, but the pages remain, dusty and waiting for the next curious reader. Morning light filters through narrow slits in the mud brick walls, painting the dust motes gold as you find yourself wandering into a courtyard piled with wooden chests and bundles wrapped in goatskin. Unlike the orderly shelves of libraries you've seen in your imagination, these manuscripts are stored in a way that feels more domestic, less museum, more family attic. And yet, every page here hums with the quiet weight of inheritance. You watch as a father unties a leather case and shows his son a book older than both of them combined. He doesn't do this with pomp or ceremony, but with the casual air of someone handing down a family recipe. This is how Timbuktu's manuscripts survived, not in state-run institutions alone, but in the hands of ordinary families who treated them as heirlooms. Historians still argue whether the majority of manuscripts were owned by households or kept in formal collections, but what's certain is that without private families, most of them would have disappeared long ago. The son leans closer, eyes wide as he traces the letters with his finger. The father warns him not to smudge the ink, which has already faded to a soft brown. The boy giggles, but obeys. You sense the scene has played out thousands of times, generations passing down books alongside family stories, almost as if each manuscript had its own family tree. You glance around the courtyard and notice something quirky. Some manuscripts are tucked into clay jars sealed with cloth. It looks more like food storage than archival practice, but it worked. Insects and moisture found it harder to reach the pages that way. You imagine a relative decades later opening one of these jars, not to find millet or beans but a text on astronomy or poetry, like stumbling on treasure at the bottom of the pantry. A woman passes by carrying a basket of laundry, and she pauses to shake her head at the clutter of books. It's a reminder that manuscripts weren't always treated with hushed reverence. Sometimes they were just part of the household mess. You chuckle, picturing a 16th-century mom complaining that manuscripts are taking up too much space in the kitchen. Even priceless artifacts get demoted when daily life demands room for grain sacks and cooking pots. As you linger, another family member lifts the lid of a chest, revealing stacks of papers loosely tied with cord. The smell of cedar and dust wafts up, sharp and earthy. He explains, almost casually, that this chest belonged to his grandfather, who taught Quranic law to students who paid with goats or grain. You realize these books didn't only store knowledge, they paid bills, earned respect, and anchored family identities. Owning manuscripts was both a spiritual inheritance and a social flex, proof that one's lineage had wisdom worth preserving. You reach into your imagination and flip one brittle page. The ink is surprisingly clear, the script looping elegantly. Margins hold tiny notes, maybe written by someone in the same family centuries earlier. You wonder whether those notes were corrections, jokes, or simple reminders like, "Don't forget to read this part before the exam." The intimacy of handwriting across generations feels strangely tender, like time folding in on itself. Nearby, a boy sneezes, sending a puff of dust into the air. Everyone laughs, even as the father scolds him lightly. You grin at the thought. Here you are, surrounded by centuries-old manuscripts, and what cuts through the solemnity is a sneeze. It's the kind of everyday silliness that history often forgets but which makes the past feel human. The father carefully closes the chest, tying its leather straps once more. He explains that families like his would sometimes bury manuscripts in secret pits during times of invasion, wrapping them in cloth or hide. Some survived, others didn't. Every discovery today is like reopening a time capsule planted out of fear but harvested with relief. Historians still argue whether the majority of manuscripts were hidden during the Moroccan invasion of 1591 or later colonial periods, but either way, survival often came down to quick thinking by ordinary people. As you prepare to leave, you notice a small scrap of parchment fluttering loose. It bears a short proverb, "Ink endures longer than memory." You whisper it softly, as if testing the truth of it in your own mouth. In Timbuktu, that phrase wasn't abstract, it was a family motto. And you carry it with you as you step back into the sunlight, realizing that dusty chests and clay jars were as powerful as marble libraries in ensuring knowledge reached the present. The afternoon heat presses down like a heavy quilt as you wander into another shaded courtyard, this one humming with the sound of scratching pens. Young students sit shoulder to shoulder, each with a wooden tablet balanced on their knees. Their teacher, an older man with a voice both stern and soothing, paces slowly, quoting passages for them to copy. This is Timbuktu's classroom, where education flowed not from grand lecture halls but from courtyards, mosques, and family porches. You kneel at the edge, listening as the boys recite lines in unison. Their rhythm is hypnotic, like waves rolling onto the shore of the Niger. The manuscripts they eventually copy are not just distant treasures, they are the end result of this daily grind, hours of repetition, ink stains on fingers, and the occasional daydreaming stare into the desert sky. Historians still argue whether most education here was reserved for elites or whether broader swaths of society participated, but the sheer number of surviving manuscripts suggests literacy wasn't rare. One boy struggles to form a letter, and the teacher taps his shoulder gently, correcting him. The boy huffs, mutters under his breath, and you chuckle at the familiarity. Students complaining about handwriting has apparently been a universal theme for centuries. Another student proudly holds up his tablet, only for the teacher to squint and declare, "Rewrite it." The groan that follows sounds exactly like the groans echoing in classrooms today. At the far side of the courtyard, a scribe demonstrates how to prepare ink. He grinds charcoal, mixes it with gum arabic, and stirs until the black liquid shines like obsidian. You can almost smell its sharp tang. Quills are sharpened, tablets polished with sand, and suddenly the act of writing feels more like a ritual than an academic chore. You imagine how much pride a student felt the first time he graduated from tablet to parchment, graduating from practice runs to permanent ink. Yet not all the learning is solemn. You overhear a student whisper a joke to his friend, "Write too slowly, and the ink will dry before your mind does." The other boy snorts so loudly the teacher glares, and for a moment you see the timelessness of classroom humor. Even in the shadow of Timbuktu's great reputation, kids found ways to entertain themselves while learning to conjugate verbs. The manuscripts produced here reflect more than theology. Lessons included mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, and poetry. One battered manuscript shows geometric diagrams, little squares and circles dancing across the page like doodles. Was it an exercise in measuring land? Or a riddle meant to test logic? Historians still argue whether these mathematical texts were advanced for their time or merely standard fare, but they prove that learning here wasn't limited to rote recitation. You also notice a girl sitting quietly in the corner, her tablet resting across her lap. She's half hidden, but her eyes are sharp as she listens. Some accounts suggest women studied and even copied manuscripts in Timbuktu, though their names rarely appear on covers. The silence of her presence is its own kind of evidence, a hint that learning extended beyond the neat categories of official history. The teacher claps his hands and the students begin to chant verses from a well-known legal text. Their voices rise in harmony, weaving into something both melodic and practical. Education here wasn't about isolated reading. It was about sound, rhythm, and memory. You can almost feel the vibrations of their chanting settling into your bones. It's the kind of drone that, if you weren't careful, might lull you into dozing off in the warm air. By the end of the lesson, students scrape their tablets clean with sand, wiping away the day's ink so the surface can be used again. The symbolism isn't lost on you. Knowledge written, erased, rewritten, layer upon layer, like dunes reshaped by wind. And when one day their writing moved onto parchment, the pages carried not just words but the echo of all those repetitions. The teacher dismisses the group with a gentle wave, and they scatter into the alleys, still muttering verses under their breath. You linger a moment longer, watching the ink pots dry in the sun. These simple courtyards, with their chants, mistakes, and jokes, were the engines that powered Timbuktu's libraries. Without them, there would be no dusty treasures to marvel at centuries later. As you step outside, the air feels charged, as if the walls themselves are still buzzing with the faint hum of recitation. And you carry the sound with you, half lullaby, half lesson, knowing that in Timbuktu, learning was as much about patience as it was about brilliance. The day wanes, and you find yourself drifting toward the riverbank, where the Niger stretches wide and calm, reflecting the desert sun like a sheet of hammered bronze. Here, trade boats bob gently against the shore, their hulls filled not only with salt and gold but also with chests of manuscripts. You pause, watching men heave bundles onto carts, and realize that Timbuktu's libraries were never confined to Timbuktu. They were nodes in a vast, buzzing network of trade. Picture caravans rolling in from the north, camels swaying under loads of salt slabs so bright they could blind you. From the south, traders bring kola nuts and ivory, their scent sharp and earthy. From the east, boats glide across the Niger with bundles of paper and ink imported from far-off lands. In return, manuscripts themselves become exports, carried out across the Sahara as prized commodities. Historians still argue whether manuscripts were traded as frequently as salt or gold, but letters from the era describe them being valued so highly that families would exchange land to acquire them. You walk among the bustle, your ears filled with the mingling of languages, Arabic, Songhai, Tamashek, Fulfulde. The sound is a living tapestry, each thread adding to the hum of exchange. Somewhere, a merchant haggles over the price of ink, while another complains about sand ruining his parchment. You smile at the timeless nature of such complaints. Shipping delays, supply issues, customers grumbling about costs. Trade life, whether in Timbuktu or on Amazon, is never smooth. One particularly animated merchant waves a manuscript in the air, bragging that it contains rare medical recipes from Egypt. His rival scoffs and insists it's a common text on trade laws. Their bickering turns heads and draws chuckles. You realize manuscripts weren't only revered, they were sometimes hyped up like collectibles, with traders exaggerating their rarity to drive up prices. Imagine a medieval version of someone trying to sell you a limited edition comic book. Beyond the haggling, you notice something quieter. A scholar approaches a merchant and negotiates not with gold but with goats. The exchange feels almost absurdly quaint, yet perfectly logical in a barter economy. A goat for a book, wool for wisdom. You wonder whether the goat buyer realized he was giving up dinner for a manuscript that centuries later would sit in a glass case, priceless. Nearby, a scribe examines bundles of paper freshly arrived from Morocco. He fingers the smooth sheets and sighs in relief. It's much better than the coarse local alternatives. You think about how something as ordinary as paper availability could shape the survival of knowledge. No paper, no manuscripts, no libraries. The grand arc of intellectual history sometimes hinges on whether enough reeds were harvested or enough camels made it through a sandstorm. The scene shifts as you notice a caravan master preparing to depart northward. His camels kneel, groaning, while boys load chests strapped tight with ropes. Some of those chests hold salt, yes, but others cradle manuscripts wrapped in leather. You imagine the journey ahead, weeks of trudging through shifting dunes, nights of bone-chilling cold, days of scorching heat. And still, these fragile papers made it across, balanced between survival and oblivion. Historians still argue how many manuscripts perished on such journeys, eaten by termites, burned in campfires, lost to raiders, but the very survival of thousands is itself miraculous. As twilight deepens, you sit on the bank and watch the last boats push off, their oars slicing the river into ripples. The sky bruises into purple and orange, and you realize how deeply knowledge and trade were braided together. Salt sustained bodies, manuscripts sustained minds. Gold gleamed in crowns, ink glimmered in ideas. The rhythm of Timbuktu's life was measured not just in coin but in words. A child tugs at your sleeve, proudly showing you a scrap of parchment covered in doodles of camels. You laugh softly, perhaps it's nothing more than a boy's idle sketch, but who knows? In another world, it might have ended up bound into a manuscript, preserved for centuries. The line between precious knowledge and casual scribble is thinner than you'd think. You rise, brushing dust from your clothes, and glance one last time at the caravans and boats receding into the desert and river alike. The hum of trade lingers in your ears, steady and endless, like the sound of waves in a dream. And you walk back toward the city, knowing that Timbuktu's dusty secrets were not just written, they were carried, bargained, and ferried across continents, stitched into the very fabric of exchange. Evening settles over Timbuktu, and lanterns flicker to life, their glow painting doorways with pools of amber. You wander through the quiet alleys, where the city hums less with trade and more with reflection. Inside one house, you overhear a group of scholars reading aloud by lamplight, their voices soft, their words almost swallowed by the night air. They are reciting from manuscripts that explore something beyond salt weights and caravan routes, matters of the soul, the unseen, and the eternal. You lean closer and catch fragments, discourses on the nature of dreams, interpretations of omens, even instructions for warding off misfortune with particular prayers. One manuscript speaks of how to recognize a dream that comes from God versus one that arises from indigestion, an oddly practical detail that makes you smile. Historians still argue whether these manuscripts should be read as mystical philosophy or everyday superstition, but either way, they show how the boundaries of science and spirit blurred here. On the mat before you lies another manuscript, its pages filled with intricate diagrams of stars and planets. But unlike the scientific charts you've seen earlier, these are laced with astrological notes, predictions of fortunes based on celestial positions. Imagine a caravan leader consulting a scholar before a journey, wanting to know whether Saturn's angle meant good trade or bad weather. It's medieval horoscopes, Timbuktu style, less about finding your soulmate and more about making sure your camels survive the desert. The scholars debate in low tones, some skeptical, others nodding earnestly. You can sense how knowledge here wasn't a straight line between fact and fiction. It was a weaving of belief, experience, and speculation. One scholar jokes that his colleague blames everything on Mercury's mischief, and the group chuckles. You smile too. Apparently, blaming planets for problems is a timeless human hobby. A little further in, you see a smaller manuscript, its cover cracked but pages surprisingly intact. It contains prayers to be recited before journeys, during illness, or when plagued by drought. Some passages are poetic, invoking God's mercy with imagery of rivers, gardens, and shade. Others are blunt, like, if your camel refuses to kneel, say this verse. You can't help laughing at the practicality. Faith in Timbuktu wasn't divorced from daily hassle, it was woven right into the ropes and saddles of life. The room grows quieter as one scholar produces a text on morality. He reads passages about kindness, honesty, and humility, his tone gentle and deliberate. The group nods, and you feel how manuscripts weren't only intellectual puzzles but guides for living. Their words served as lanterns in a world of uncertainty. You imagine students hearing these same verses centuries ago, memorizing them not just for exams but for shaping their daily choices. Still, not all was solemn. Someone quips about how even the most pious text won't stop mosquitoes from biting, and the laughter bubbles up again. It's a reminder that spirituality and skepticism have always danced together, never quite separating. Even the most profound manuscript might share shelf space with recipes for bug repellent. As the scholars close their books, they handle them carefully, smoothing the pages, tucking them back into leather covers. You notice how reverence doesn't mean stiffness. They treat the manuscripts like trusted elders, respected, yes, but also teased and questioned. That balance feels uniquely human, the way we hold on to wisdom with one hand while poking it with the other to see if it still holds up. When the lamps burn lower, the group begins a soft chant, verses rising and falling like waves on the Niger. The sound is hypnotic, each syllable stretching into the air like threads of smoke. You lean back, eyelids heavy, lulled by the cadence. The manuscripts may be silent objects, but through voices, they come alive, bridging centuries, carrying prayers and debates into the present. Outside, the desert wind picks up, slipping between walls and tugging gently at your clothes. You step back into the night, the echoes of chanting fading behind you. Overhead, the stars blaze brighter, and you wonder how many travelers once gazed up at the same constellations after reading these very texts. Faith, science, superstition, and humor, all mingled here, preserved in ink that still whispers across time. The desert dawn comes quietly, first with a band of pale lavender on the horizon, then with the faint crowing of a rooster hidden somewhere among mud-brick courtyards. You rub your eyes, step onto a rooftop, and watch the city stretch awake. The markets will buzz again soon, but for now, your attention drifts not to scholars or merchants, but to the keepers of the manuscripts, the families who carried the burden of preservation through centuries of dust, war, and neglect. You picture them sitting cross-legged in dim rooms, brushing sand from fragile spines with feathers, or patching a page with a scrap of goatskin. These weren't state-funded archivists with gleaming halls and air-conditioned stacks. They were mothers, uncles, apprentices, neighbors, ordinary people who understood that their books were more than objects. They were memory itself. And memory, like bread, had to be guarded. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's manuscripts survived mainly because of deliberate guardianship or sheer luck. The truth is probably both. During invasions, families hid their manuscripts under floorboards, in sealed trunks, even buried in clay jars beneath goat pens. One story tells of an imam who carried bundles of books into the desert disguised as sacks of millet. Another describes children trained to memorize whole texts, in case ink faded or pages crumbled. Imagine the pressure of being 12 years old and responsible for remembering a century's worth of astronomy. Your own middle school homework seems trivial by comparison. Of course, the challenges were endless. Termites were voracious, humidity was merciless, and sandstorms showed no respect for fragile parchment. Some families developed quirky coping methods. One tale suggests pages were smeared lightly with a mixture of honey and smoke to repel insects, though scholars today debate if that would preserve the ink or just create very sticky books. Either way, you admire the creativity. Then came the colonial era, when European explorers stumbled across these collections. Some saw them as curiosities to ship home, others dismissed them as primitive relics. A French officer supposedly remarked, "Africans cannot have written books of worth," before tripping over a chest filled with centuries of medical treatises and poetry. The irony was thick enough to spread on flatbread. Even after independence, the manuscripts were often ignored, left in cupboards, or traded casually. Yet families persisted. In hushed tones, they would explain to their children, "This is your inheritance. Guard it better than gold." You imagine a teenager rolling their eyes, wishing for coins instead of crumbly paper, only to realize decades later what treasures they've been given. In the 21st century, new dangers arrived. Militants swept through northern Mali, threatening to destroy anything considered un-Islamic. Suddenly, centuries of patient care faced obliteration. And so, families once again became smugglers of wisdom. In 2012, under cover of night, thousands of manuscripts were packed into metal trunks, loaded into carts, and ferried secretly downriver to Bamako. It was a rescue operation without fanfare, driven by librarians and cab drivers rather than soldiers. Hollywood could never script something so quietly heroic. Some trunks were disguised with onions on top, so passing guards would think the cargo nothing more than groceries. Others were hidden in women's baskets of laundry. You smile at the image, folded shirts protecting philosophical treatises, socks shielding astronomy charts. Laundry day meets archival preservation. Today, many of these rescued manuscripts are housed in safer conditions, digitized page by page under fluorescent lights. But you sense that the true preservation still lies in the memory of families, in the whispered pride of grandparents who recall carrying trunks through the desert. No database can replace that. And yet, the work is far from finished. Countless manuscripts remain in private homes, stacked in cupboards, their owners reluctant to surrender them. Not out of greed, but because of an old instinct. These are family, not artifacts. They belong in the rhythm of daily life, guarded with the same vigilance one gives to recipes or lullabies. Outsiders may see dusty papers. Locals see ancestors speaking through ink. As the sun rises higher, you stroll past a courtyard where an old man carefully spreads a manuscript on a reed mat, letting the morning breeze dry its pages after a night of humidity. His grandson watches intently, mimicking the gestures with a stick and scrap of cardboard. The boy asks a question, and the old man answers with a proverb, "The one who knows the word holds the world." You pause, letting the word sink in. The manuscripts of Timbuktu survived not because they were indestructible, but because people treated them like fragile children, protected fiercely, hidden when threatened, and passed down with faith that the next generation would do the same. You realize you're walking in a city where history itself was carried on human backs, disguised under onions, or tucked inside laundry baskets. That's resilience in its quietest, most enduring form. The call to prayer floats across rooftops, mingling with the smell of fresh bread. The city is fully awake now, and yet the manuscripts continue their hidden life in trunks and cupboards, still guarded, still alive. And you, lucky wanderer, get to glimpse how dust and ink can outlast armies. By the time afternoon heat presses down on Timbuktu, you find yourself drifting into a courtyard where digital scanners hum like oversized insects. A few young archivists sit at tables, gloved hands turning fragile pages, their expressions a mix of reverence and exhaustion. This is the modern era of the manuscripts, a shift from whispered oral legacies and hidden trunks to humming computers and glowing screens. You lean over a shoulder and see a centuries-old medical treatise glowing on a monitor, every ink stroke magnified into crisp pixels. The archivist clicks gently, as if afraid the mouse might bruise the parchment. It's strangely hypnotic. The old words, once buried under goat dung and sandstorms, now blinking on a screen like they were written yesterday. Historians still argue whether digitization can ever capture the soul of a manuscript. The texture of the parchment, the faint scent of smoke, the way ink bleeds just slightly at the edges. A PDF file doesn't smell of history, it smells of hard drives. Yet, as you watch, you realize that survival sometimes requires compromise. Better pixels than ashes. The process is not glamorous. Scanners jam, power cuts interrupt uploads, and funding is a constant headache. One archivist mutters that the generator drinks more fuel than a thirsty camel. Another jokes that the manuscripts themselves must be cursing the technology. After all, some pages refuse to lie flat, curling like stubborn old men refusing to pose for portraits. You chuckle quietly, even paper can have attitude. Still, the scale is staggering. Thousands of manuscripts, each page photographed, tagged, and stored on servers far beyond Mali. Somewhere in Europe or America, a researcher will one day sip coffee while scrolling through recipes for camel ointments or star charts drawn with patient hands centuries ago. It feels almost unfair that someone could access this treasure in pajamas, without even brushing sand from their hair. But digitization also creates odd dilemmas. Some families, proud of their heritage, hesitate to see their manuscripts taken into global databases. They ask, if the world has copies, will they forget we exist? It's a valid fear that the human keepers might become invisible once the texts float free in cyberspace. Preservation can sometimes feel like erasure. You watch a young woman carefully slide a page beneath the scanner glass. She explains, softly, that her grandfather once carried manuscripts under his robe during the 2012 crisis. Now, she's ensuring those same texts will outlive both of them. The circle feels complete, from smuggling to scanning, from hidden trunks to cloud servers. The manuscripts have become nomads once more, wandering across the digital desert. And yet, for all the seriousness, the workroom has its lighter side. Someone has pinned a cartoon to the wall, a camel wearing glasses, reading a manuscript under a desk lamp. The caption, proof that even camels study in Timbuktu. The archivists giggle whenever they walk past it, and you can't help smiling too. It's proof that humor survives in any archive. Evening draws near, and the scanning slows. A student picks up his guitar, strumming softly in a corner. The gentle chords mix with the quiet whir of machines, creating a soundscape both ancient and modern. You close your eyes and imagine the manuscripts themselves humming along, centuries of wisdom being sung into wires, stored as data, waiting for future dreamers to rediscover. You wonder what the scholars of old would think of all this. Would they marvel at the ability to send their words across oceans in seconds, or scoff at the absence of smell and touch? Maybe both. After all, they too lived at the intersection of practicality and imagination, where astronomy guided caravans and astrology guided choices. They would probably nod knowingly and say, every age has its tools. Just use them well. The sun sets, painting the sky in streaks of rose and copper. The scanners are switched off, covers are gently closed, and the courtyard empties. The manuscripts remain, half in their ancient skins, half in the glowing realm of servers and screens. Like travelers, they have adapted yet again, proving that survival is not about stubbornness but about flexibility. You step out into the cooling air, realizing that Timbuktu's manuscripts no longer belong solely to Timbuktu. They belong to anyone willing to listen. And yet, the city still holds their heart, the pulse that no server can replicate. For now, you carry that pulse with you, walking beneath stars that look the same as they did to scribes centuries ago. Night deepens once more over Timbuktu, the city a quiet silhouette against the Sahara. You settle into a shaded alcove, gazing out toward the dunes that stretch endlessly into darkness. This feels like the right place to let the story circle back on itself, to trace what all these manuscripts, secrets, and survival tales mean when taken together. You recall the scribes hunched over their desks, scratching ink onto parchment while roosters crowed outside. You picture the caravans that hauled salt and books alike, trudging through the desert with bells clanging softly. You think of families hiding their treasures under laundry, of librarians carrying trunks downriver under moonlight. And you think of the young archivists today, clicking scanners with the same care their ancestors once used to bind parchment. It's a single thread stretching across centuries, woven into Timbuktu's dusty air. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's reputation as a city of golden libraries was exaggerated by dazzled travelers or rooted in cold fact. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, not an African Alexandria with marble halls, but something more intimate, more human, a patchwork of family archives, mosque libraries, and private collections. The grandeur is not in scale but in persistence. Against all odds, these books refuse to vanish. What lingers is how much the manuscripts reveal about human universals. Astronomy mingled with horoscopes, medical cures sat beside prayers, and moral treatises rubbed shoulders with camel ointments. The knowledge wasn't separated into tidy categories, it was lived. You realize you could drop a modern reader into a 15th century study circle, and they'd find familiar debates. Does diet affect health? Are dreams messages? Should you blame Mercury for your problems? The accents change, but the questions remain. One quirky detail sticks with you, the prayer for stubborn camels. It makes you chuckle because isn't that just human history in miniature? Big ideas about morality and stars, folded alongside everyday complaints about animals not cooperating. Maybe the true soul of Timbuktu lies not in lofty philosophy but in that blend of sacred and silly. The manuscript's survival also whispers something larger, that heritage lives through people, not institutions. When armies came, it was bakers, imams, and children who saved the texts. When militants threatened, it was librarians and cab drivers who carried trunks to safety. No grand empire or state decreed their survival, ordinary hands did. It's a reminder that you, too, in your quiet acts, saving a letter, telling a story, teaching a child, become part of history's fragile chain. And as you sit there, stars pricking the night sky, you wonder how future generations will see this moment. Will they find dusty USB drives and chuckle at their quaintness? Will they still marvel at camel horoscopes? Maybe they'll ask whether we preserved our knowledge with the same care. A warm breeze brushes past, carrying the faint scent of bread cooling in ovens. Somewhere, a voice recites evening prayers, and you imagine those words joining the invisible chorus of centuries, chants, lectures, jokes, arguments, all layered into the fabric of Timbuktu's nights. The manuscripts may be fragile, but the ideas they carry are as enduring as the desert stars. And with that realization, your eyelids grow heavy. The desert hush seems to invite rest, to fold you gently into its rhythm. Timbuktu's story does not end, it simply drifts, like sand on the wind, carrying secrets from one dreamer to the next. So here we are, at the end of this long wandering through Timbuktu's libraries. The story has wound its way from dim courtyards filled with dust and whispers to the hum of scanners in bright modern rooms, and finally to the still hush of the desert night. The manuscripts are safe, for now, carried in trunks and in clouds, and in the memories of those who love them. You can let your shoulders soften as you picture them, resting quietly on their shelves, pages breathing slowly as though they too are alive. Imagine the ink glowing faintly in the lantern light, words drifting like smoke, ancient yet familiar. Every page is a sigh, every margin a pause, every note a heartbeat. Nothing demands your attention anymore, you don't have to hold on to the details. You can let them dissolve, like sand slipping through open hands. The desert stretches endlessly, soft and unhurried, its dunes rising and falling like waves on a sleeping ocean. Overhead, stars scatter in patient clusters, shining with the same calm brilliance that scholars once charted. Their light asks nothing of you, only that you rest under it, safe and small, part of something vast and quiet. Even the manuscripts close their covers now, their voices fading to murmurs, promising they'll still be here when you wake. You have walked far tonight, through time and dust, through prayer and laughter, through wisdom both lofty and ordinary. And now, all that remains is rest. So breathe slowly, deeply. Let the stillness gather around you like a blanket. The story lingers, but you don't need to follow anymore. You can drift, as softly as paper, as gently as a desert wind, into sleep.